I think that all of us in this community have a duty to see ourselves as individual parts of a much bigger collective that's educating and advocating for these programs.
That's Ilir Zherka. Before he became a nonprofit and political leader in D.C., Ilir was a breakdancing, hip-hop-loving Albanian refugee growing up in the Bronx. His family and the extended Albanian immigrant community felt a sense of duty to advocate for their ancestral country. As a result, family outings when Ilir was young were more likely to be political rallies than trips to the beach. That sense of political activism and civic duty greatly influenced Ilir and led him into his political and nonprofit career. He's now the executive director of the Alliance for International Exchange in D.C. He stopped by the InterExchange office recently to talk about his background and his work advocating for international exchange programs. I'm Mark Overman, and this is Voices of InterExchange. We're alive.
All right, the audience, where's the hype?
Ilir's his own personal hype man. Thanks everyone for joining on a Friday midday afternoon, kind of rainy here in New York. But thanks to Ilir Zherka, the executive director of the Alliance for International Exchange in D.C., for joining us. Ilir, welcome. So before we get talking more about the Alliance's specific work, let's talk a little bit about you.
Yeah.
But what was it like growing up in the Bronx within the Albanian community?
Yeah.
Talk more about that.
Yeah, it was an incredible experience. So we came here in '68 as refugees. My family and I was 2.5 years old. People can do the math in terms of age. Large family, my grandparents, and there weren't a lot of Albanian Americans or Albanians here at the time. But we grew up, in the 70s and early 80s. New York was both exciting and very dangerous together. Maybe that's why it was exciting. But it was a time when there was a lot going on, from the blackouts to the bankruptcies to all sorts of other crazy stuff. And there was that element of danger. Whenever I come here and I ride the subway, I'm like, back in the day, like going on the subway was inviting potential, harm. And of course, the subway, I don't think is viewed that way, or maybe it still is, but I don't know.
I don't think so.
But
Not
on
exactly.
the other end, I grew up in the Bronx when hip hop was being born. From graffiti to breakdancing to rap, I mean, it was all on the street. And when I mean on the street, I mean like literally on the street. Rap groups back then would pop open the lights in schoolyards and plug in their sound system, and they would perform concerts, and it would be sort of spur of the moment. There were places where that was happening also within clubs, but it was like that, right? And I remember being a part of that as a young kid. I was really young, but we started everything early back then in our youth, especially if you're in the outer boroughs. So graffiti, breakdancing, rap. If you're like 11 and 12 and 13 and 14, you were doing all that stuff.
So you're telling us you were breakdancing
as
an 11-year-old.
I was doing it all. And being a part of that was just phenomenal, right? And at the same time, punk rock was being born in New York, disco. And so there was so much creativity that was happening at the local level. And so it was an amazing experience. Being part of an immigrant community, had its difficulties. I mean, we were sort of outsiders. I grew up, many of the years I spent in the Bronx, I spent in the South Bronx, and so we were different in all sorts of ways. And, our names, everything about us. And so acclimating had its difficulties on occasion. But that meant that the Albanian community was really tight-knit and strong. The high school I went to, if you were an Albanian, you were a cousin, right? And we pretended like people were actually our cousins. So it was like, oh, that's my cousin, that's my cousin. We were all cousins. And that was really cool. And, the typical immigrant experience moved into the inner city. When we first got here, people picked up all sorts of jobs. as doormen, and there's still lots of Albanians who are doormen, but also restaurants.
What was your experience like over the years with your relationship actually with Albania? I know you went back when you were a bit older in life for an exchange program, but did you go back with family regularly?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So, political refugees, I think this is true for a lot of political refugees. You leave your homeland because you feel forced to, because you're being mistreated in some way, and certainly as minority Albanians in the former Yugoslavia, we felt that way. And so there was this weird dynamic where so much of us, so many people in the community felt like we were here temporarily and we were going back. I mean, that's the way we were raised. It's like, okay, so everyone, you have to learn Albanian, and because we're going back. Communism will fall, there'll be a democracy, and we're going back. So we grew up with that sort of identification. And then there was also, we made it here, so there are all these things that we have to do for the people we left behind. So whether it was money, clothes, support. So, I like to say growing up, my 6 siblings and I went as frequently to the beach as a family as we did to rallies as a family. I mean, really, that's what the dynamic was. So we grew up very politically aware and involved and with a sense of duty. And so, when communism fell, I went back with my then girlfriend, now wife, to Albania for an exchange program, actually, to help them with their transition to democracy. And actually, it was her idea. She's not Albanian. She's American. Her family's been here for, since the Mayflower. But she's like, I have a great idea. Let's go back to Albania. I was like, that's not a great idea. You know what it's like? And, of course, I was the, what's the word I'm looking for? The person who went out and lived there for a while, and everyone wanted to know when I came back, the scout, I guess is what I'm looking for. Everyone wanted to know, can we go back and live there? And what would that be like? And my dad, among the group was a real nationalist. And part of the answer was, well, yeah, you can, but here's what you need to be prepared for. We had water an hour a day, 3 times a day. Wages are $30 a month. There are all sorts of things you can get. So that was the experience. I did get a chance early in my career, and this is when, when I made a switch from a really sort of political career. I came back from Albania, worked on Capitol Hill, and I thought I would do that circuit, right? Campaign, executive branch, maybe a law firm, the Hill. I wanted to support nonprofits, but I didn't really see myself running one. And then the wars in the former Yugoslavia broke out, and we saw a war coming in Kosovo, and so we helped to create this organization. We couldn't find the right ED. And again, my wife, who gets me in trouble often, said, it's you. You're supposed to do this job. And so we like to say that, the Yugoslav government kicked us out. We came to the United States, and then we kicked them out of Kosovo, which is part of what happened.
Well, it sounds like you described growing up with this very politically active family community, and that, to me, clearly has translated into your career, it seems, because you've been, like you said, first in government, but since you're at the Alliance, your 4th nonprofit organization in your career. What's the kind of common thread?
Commonality. So the commonality for all those organizations is really a focus on engagement of people trying to better the world, either through democratic reforms or mutual understanding or whatever combination of people. But it's very people-focused on communities trying to make a big difference. And so I think that's the commonality. Also, the strategies by which those 4 organizations have pursued their work have been really similar, right? So most of those organizations were advocacy-focused. So on the Hill, in some cases working with the State Department, media-focused, coalition building and running. We know that our societies are stronger, families, connections, the workplace. People are stronger when they get to know each other, and if they cross boundaries, borders, cultures to do that, then that's fantastic, and that's what happens, right? And it's very similar to what we see with volunteerism, national service, even voting in other, community organizations. Something really similar happens. So, in fact, national service experience, which I helped to promote in that last job, we created something called the Service Year Alliance, is not too different from an exchange experience, in fact. Similar things happen with the individual, right? You transform internally, a lot that you learn about yourself, a lot that you learn about the community you live in, the country you're from, and then other places too. And of course, I was on an exchange program. I helped to create one, and exchange programs have been a constant throughout those jobs in some form or fashion.
So shift a little bit now, and let's talk about what's going on in D.C. and what the Alliance is working on. I think this group knows a lot about, but maybe not all of the details of the challenges exchange programs have faced over the last 2.5 or so years. So maybe you can take us through sort of where we've been, where we are now, where you see us going, and within that, the work the Alliance is doing on behalf of InterExchange and all of our fellow exchange organizations.
So let me put this in some context. Every 50, 60 years or so, the United States goes through what we're going through now, which is an inflection point on who we are, our culture, what we look like as a group, and as we go through that, the people who have been here before, right, because we are basically an immigrant nation who came earlier than the most recent immigrants, get anxious about the newcomers. There was a time in 2017 when it felt like exchange programs would be at the center of that effort to reform, change, limit internationals coming to the United States. We galvanized, and InterExchange was a really key player in this, our community and other communities, to do a lot of work to kind of separate out J1 programs from that effort, and we've been relatively successful to date. But what that means is that two things are true. One is that could change at any moment, so we have to be vigilant. The other thing it means is that there is pressure within the administration, within all agencies of government that deal with visas in some way, to make changes and reforms. And those changes and reforms can have a significant impact. But we are at a stage where things are really delicate and we have to be really mindful.
It's interesting, too, where we've come from literally the last 2 years. 2 years ago, almost at this time, we were getting word that there are perhaps memos circulating saying, let's do away with a variety of exchange programs, including the 5 categories that we all work on, which, of course, was this big existential threat, obviously, but something we were like, one problem, let's all get to work on it.
Yeah.
And that really helped us galvanize so many people in our community. Now, as you're saying, we're at this point where that big existential threat doesn't seem to be looming. Instead, it's a lot of other smaller things happening. So how, from your perspective at the Alliance, how do we shift our advocacy strategy to deal with that? And how do we, at InterExchange, get involved in that? How do we involve our hosts when there's not one big sort of overarching problem to solve? It's many smaller problems that are harder to define.
Yeah. I would say two of the things that we should be focusing on now are the things that you should be doing always, right? So one is run really good programs.
Done.
All right, InterExchange has got that covered. And that's really important, right? And it starts with like who you select to select people abroad. I mean, those have to be the right people coming in for the right reasons. That is so important. That is probably the biggest advocacy thing you can do, honestly. That is the biggest thing you can do, is run really good programs and bring the right people here who have the right expectations for why they're coming. The second thing is advocacy is so much about information and relationships, right? So what are we doing collectively to build relationships where we don't have them, to maintain the ones that we do have, and what are we providing by way of information and experiences for two groups of people, decision makers and influence makers, right? Or opinion makers. So decision makers are the people in power who have power over these programs. So at ECA, the State Department, on the Hill, the administration, how are we providing them with both information and experiences? So especially experiences, because you all know when you experience something individually, you understand it better than if someone gives you a report or shows you something or talks about it. And so part of what we are trying to do at the Alliance is to come up with the facilitation and the tools that enables you all to do that, to strengthen, to create those relationships where they don't exist, to strengthen them where they do, to think about what you share, to think about how you connect with those people, and to do that regularly. Bring it back to that first question about growing up in New York and in this community. You know, we viewed ourselves as part of the solution to problems back home, the homeland we left, right, as a duty to do something. And my view, and you've heard me say this, Mark, and other places, is I think that all of us in this community have a duty to see ourselves as individual parts of a much bigger collective that's educating and advocating for these programs. I would talk about engagement, really, because what we're talking about is engagement. You have to do 95% of the work before you can ask somebody to do something for you, right? I mean, you have to have been there and have the relationship. Sure, you can go to someone, let's say in the administration or on the Hill and say, or even a reporter and say, hey, I want you to cover this or do this or write this. But they're going to look at you with some suspicion. Who are you? Why didn't you come to me before? But if you have that relationship, they have the information, then you can do it. So, and I feel like, you know, engagement is a word that people like, and it really adequately reflects what we're talking about.
So it's 1:30, and we promised we'd get you out of here no later than 1:45. But thank you for joining us. I think this was really great. Can you all join me in thanking Ilir?
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks. And thanks for everything you all do.
That was Ilir Zherka, Executive Director of the Alliance for International Exchange. For more information on InterExchange programs and grant opportunities, you can visit our website at interexchange.org and follow us on social media. I'm Mark Overman, and thanks for listening to Voices of InterExchange.